The stars linger strangely above the white mountains tonight, as if the heavens themselves remember an old promise. Welcome, my friend. I'm John, and I'm glad you've chosen to walk this road with me. There are tales that begin with kings, and others that begin with silence, when an empty throne waits beneath ancient stone and faithful hands keep watch through the passing years. Draw a little closer to the fire, listen well, and let us step together into the deep history of Middle-earth. The white tower of Minas Tirith stood silent beneath a pale winter sky, its banners hanging still in the cold air, as though even the wind hesitated to disturb the city. Within the Hall of the Kings, the great throne remained empty, its carved arms worn smooth by the hands of rulers whose line had reached back to the glory of Númenor. Lamps burned with steady flame along the walls, casting warm light across ancient statues and polished stone, yet no king sat beneath the crown of Gondor. Messengers moved quietly through the corridors, speaking in hushed voices, for every man in the city knew that their lord, King Eärnur, had ridden east many years before to answer the challenge of the Lord of Minas Morgul. He had vanished beyond the haunted gates and never returned. No rider had brought word of victory or defeat, and hope had faded into certainty. Gondor had lost its king without witness, leaving behind a kingdom that could not remain without a ruler. The captains, counselors, and lords of the realm gathered beneath the vaulted ceiling of the hall, where the weight of centuries rested as heavily as the stone itself. Among them stood Mardil Voronvo, steward of the king, a man whose silver-threaded hair and calm bearing concealed the burden already pressing upon his shoulders. His father had served before him, as had his grandfather, for the House of Hurin had long guided the affairs of Gondor, while kings rode to war or governed distant provinces. Yet this moment differed from every duty that had come before. There was no prince waiting to inherit the throne, no younger son hidden in some southern fortress, and no certainty that Eärnur still drew breath. Every eye turned toward Mardil, not because he sought power, but because responsibility had quietly found him. An aged lord from Lossarnach stepped forward and broke the silence that had settled over the chamber. "The realm cannot wait upon shadows," he said, his voice rough with years spent in war and counsel alike. "If the king has fallen, Gondor must endure, and someone must bear the burden until the line is restored." No man answered at once. Mardil lowered his gaze toward the floor of polished black stone, where the reflection of the empty throne stretched toward him like a road disappearing into darkness. He had devoted his life to serving kings, never imagining that one day he would be asked to govern without one. The thought brought him no pride, only the cold certainty that refusing the task would invite disorder throughout the realm. Outside the citadel, ordinary life continued with stubborn determination, despite the uncertainty hanging over the kingdom. Smiths hammered glowing iron into spearheads, their rhythmic blows echoing through narrow streets where merchants arranged baskets of apples, onions, and winter herbs beneath canvas awnings. Soldiers drilled upon the training grounds, shields striking together with practiced force, while young recruits struggled to match the discipline of hardened veterans. Children chased one another through the lower circles of the city, laughing as though kings and wars belonged only to the concerns of grown men. Yet beneath those familiar sounds lingered anxious whispers that drifted from marketplace to tavern. People wondered who would command the armies if enemies crossed the Anduin, who would judge disputes among the nobles, and who possessed the right to speak for Gondor before neighboring realms. Before sunset, Mardil climbed alone to the highest court of the citadel, where the white tree stood. Though old and barren, its pale branches reached toward the fading light with quiet dignity, reminding every Gondorian that hope could survive long seasons of waiting. Mardil rested one hand against the cool stone surrounding its roots and looked eastward beyond the walls, where distant mountains concealed the valley of Minas Morgul. Somewhere beyond those dark ridges, the last king had vanished into the enemy's grasp, carried by courage that had become recklessness. "If you still live," Mardil murmured into the evening air, "may the valor grant you strength. If you have fallen, may I prove worthy of the trust left behind." No answer came, except the cry of a circling eagle far above the city. When dawn returned, the great bell of Minas Tirith called the lords together once more. Formal robes replaced armor, and ancient scrolls were carried into the hall so that no custom of Gondor would be forgotten during the council. Learned scribes recited the laws preserved since the days of Elendel, tracing every succession and every oath sworn by kings and their servants. They found no command for such an hour, only the understanding that the steward existed to preserve the realm when necessity demanded it. At last, the oldest among the lawmasters closed the final scroll with careful hands and spoke plainly. "Until the king returns," he declared, "let the steward rule in his name, guarding the throne but never claiming it." The word settled over the assembly with the weight of judgment rather than celebration. Mardil accepted the white rod of office without triumph. He held it across both hands before the empty throne and bowed deeply, acknowledging not authority gained, but duty inherited. Those gathered in the hall followed his example, kneeling before the vacant seat instead of before the steward himself. The gesture mattered more than any proclamation. It reminded every witness that Gondor had not abandoned its kingship, only entrusted its care to faithful hands until fate revealed another heir. From that day onward, Mardil would be known as the first ruling steward, though in his own heart he remained only the chief servant of a crown no living man could wear. The first weeks of his rule offered little time for reflection. Reports arrived from Ithilien, describing increased movement along the borders where dark riders had been glimpsed beneath moonless skies. Corsair ships were said to be gathering in distant harbors of Umbar, while traders traveling north carried uneasy tales of Easterlings forging new alliances beyond the Sea of Rune. None of these threats had yet crossed into open war, but seasoned captains recognized the familiar signs of enemies measuring Gondor's strength. Mardil spent long hours studying maps spread across a broad oak table, listening more than he spoke, while veterans debated roads, river crossings, and the condition of frontier fortresses. Every decision reminded him that hesitation could cost lives. One cold evening, Captain Baranor returned from the eastern marches, with dust still clinging to his cloak and boots. He bowed only briefly before spreading a rough map upon the council table, where fresh markings showed abandoned farms near the Anduin. "Our patrols found no armies," he reported, "but they found silence where villages once welcomed them. Families are moving west before fear itself becomes an invader." Mardil traced the river with one finger, imagining empty fields left untended and homes standing dark beneath gathering clouds. "Then we must give those people reason to remain," he answered quietly. "Walls defend a kingdom, but so do the farmers who sow its bread and the fishermen who cast their nets before sunrise." Orders went forth across Gondor before another week had passed. Garrisons received fresh supplies, bridges were repaired, and messengers rode from province to province, carrying sealed commands marked with the white seal of the steward. Grain stores were inspected so that hungry winters would not weaken the people before any enemy could. Veteran companies rotated to exposed frontiers while younger soldiers remained near the capital to complete their training under experienced officers. Mardil insisted upon visiting the storehouses and barracks himself instead of relying solely upon written reports. The soldiers noticed that he remembered names, asked practical questions, and listened carefully to complaints that lesser rulers might have dismissed. Respect grew quietly, earned through steady labor rather than grand speeches. As winter deepened, Minas Tirith settled into a rhythm shaped by vigilance instead of panic. Watchfires burned each night upon the hills beyond the city, their distant glow reassuring travelers that Gondor remained awake while darkness covered the land. Merchants resumed their journeys with cautious confidence, and craftsmen filled the markets with goods carried from every corner of the realm. Yet Mardil understood that peace possessed its own dangers, for comfort tempted men to forget the patient malice gathering beyond their borders. Standing upon the walls beneath a sky bright with cold stars, he felt the kingdom breathing steadily behind him, while the empty lands stretched eastward in uneasy silence. The throne remained vacant, the king remained lost, and the long watch of the stewards had only just begun. Spring came slowly to Gondor, drawing green from the fields of Lothar and filling the orchards of Lebanon with blossoms that drifted upon the wind like pale snow. The Anduin swelled with the melting waters flowing down from the misty mountains, carrying timber, grain, and merchant vessels toward the southern havens. To those who looked only upon the land, it seemed that Gondor had entered another season of peace. Yet every courier arriving at the gates of Minas Tirith carried tidings that spoke of unease beyond the borders. Scouts stationed along the Ephel Duth reported strange fires burning at night where no settlements had stood before, while hunters in Ithilien found tracks of armed companies crossing hidden paths beneath the shadow of the mountains. Mardil read every report himself before dawn, knowing that small warnings often grew into great disasters when ignored. The steward called his captains together in a chamber overlooking the eastern walls, where maps covered nearly every table and shelf. Wooden markers carved into the shapes of towers, ships, and cavalry stood upon the painted parchment, each one representing lives that might soon be tested. Captain Baranor rested both hands upon the map of Ithilien and pointed toward the crossings of the Anduin. "They are probing," he said, "not attacking, only watching. Someone beyond the river wishes to know how swiftly Gondor answers." Mardil remained silent for a long moment before moving a carved horse farther north. "Then we shall answer before they ask a second question. Double the patrols, but do not pursue shadows into the hills. Let them see discipline instead of fear." Within days, mounted companies rode east beneath the white banner of the steward, their polished helms flashing beneath the spring sun. They crossed the river at Osgiliath, whose mighty bridges still stood firm despite the long years since its days as the capital of Gondor. Farmers paused from ploughing to watch the soldiers pass, offering bread, water, and quiet blessings as the riders continued toward the frontier. The captains accepted every gift with gratitude, understanding that the strength of Gondor rested not only in swords, but also in the trust between its people and those sworn to defend them. Mardil himself accompanied the host as far as Osgiliath, refusing the comfort of remaining behind the walls of Minas Tirith while others bore the burden. The ruined beauty of Ithilien stirred memories, even in men too young to remember its greatest days. Ancient roads built by the kings of old still crossed the forests, though moss crept over the stones and roots broke through the once perfect paving. Wildflowers covered abandoned gardens where noble houses had long since fallen into silence, while birds nested among cracked pillars carved with the emblems of forgotten families. Baranor looked across the landscape with admiration, touched by sorrow. "This land still remembers better days," he said quietly. Mardil nodded. "Then it is our task to ensure it remembers them long enough to see them return." Their journey ended at a watch fort overlooking one of the lesser crossings of the Anduin. The garrison commander welcomed the steward with evident surprise, for few rulers traveled so far merely to inspect an isolated post. The walls were sound, but the men were weary after months of constant vigilance. Mardil walked among them without ceremony, asking how many arrows remained in storage, how often fresh horses arrived, and whether the nearby villages had suffered raids. One grey-haired archer hesitated before speaking honestly. "We can hold this place, my lord," he said, "but we cannot watch every ford from dawn until dusk forever." Mardil studied the broad river below, where the current glittered beneath the afternoon light. "No," he replied, "but together the forts may watch one another. We defend Gondor best when no outpost stands alone." That evening, as darkness settled over the eastern bank, one of the sentries gave a sharp call from the tower. Every man upon the walls seized his weapon, and torches were quickly extinguished so that eyes could better search the darkness. Across the river, distant lights flickered among the trees before vanishing almost at once. Baranor narrowed his gaze. "Campfires covered too quickly," he whispered. "They know what they are doing." A younger lieutenant reached for his bow, eager to cross before dawn, but Mardil raised one hand. "No. An unseen enemy chooses the ground. We choose patience." Though the order frustrated several officers, none questioned it aloud. Before sunrise, a small company crossed the river under cover of mist, not to attack, but to learn. They found trampled earth where horses had stood during the night, cold ashes hidden beneath fresh soil, and broken branches carefully scattered to conceal the number of travelers. Whoever had camped there possessed discipline uncommon among wandering outlaws. Baranor crouched beside a footprint pressed deep into the damp ground. "Heavy armor," he observed. "Enough men to concern us, too few to challenge a fortress." Mardil examined the trail leading back toward the eastern hills. "Then they were measuring us, just as we believed. Let them carry home this lesson, that Gondor watches every crossing." Upon returning to Minas Tirith, Mardil expanded the chain of communication between the frontier forts. Fresh horses were stationed along the great roads so that messages could travel from Ithilien to the White City in astonishing speed. Signal beacons received new stores of wood and oil, while veteran riders were assigned solely to carry warnings during times of danger. Some members of the council questioned the expense. "The treasury is not without limits," one lord remarked carefully. Mardil rested the white rod across the council table and answered without raising his voice. "Gold spent before war often saves blood during it. That is a bargain Gondor should never refuse." The months passed, and the expected invasion failed to come. Instead, scattered raiders tested isolated villages before vanishing into the wilderness whenever patrols approached. Though the attacks remained small, they carried a purpose beyond theft. The raiders sought to unsettle the frontier, to persuade families that life east of the Anduin no longer held safety. Mardil answered not by withdrawing his people, but by strengthening them. Stone watchtowers rose beside lonely roads, wells were repaired, and villages received trained guards drawn from nearby garrisons. The steward understood that abandoning land without a fight invited future enemies to claim it without cost. During one of his journeys through Anorion, Mardil stopped beside a farmhouse where an elderly woman offered him fresh bread, still warm from the oven. She looked upon the white rod carried by his attendants before meeting his eyes with surprising boldness. "My father served under King Eärnur," she said. "He feared no battle, but he always feared that Gondor might one day forget the people who filled its fields." Mardil accepted the bread with both hands. "If Gondor forgets its people," he replied, "then no king, steward, or captain deserves to rule it." The woman smiled faintly before returning to her work, and the steward carried her words with him long after the farmhouse had disappeared behind the hills. Years slipped by, and the realm remained unbroken despite the quiet pressure gathering beyond its borders. Children born after Eärnur's disappearance grew old enough to carry spears, knowing no ruler but the steward who governed beneath the empty throne. The white rod became a familiar symbol throughout Gondor, not of royal ambition, but of steadfast guardianship. Travelers crossing the realm found roads kept in good repair, markets busy with trade, and soldiers alert wherever danger might appear. Mardil often wondered whether history would remember these peaceful years at all, for victories won without battles seldom filled the songs of minstrels. Yet he believed that preserving peace required as much courage as winning wars. One evening, as the sun sank crimson beyond the White Mountains, a weary messenger reached Minas Tirith from the southern coast. Salt stained his cloak, and exhaustion lined his face after riding without rest. Kneeling before the steward, he delivered tidings that changed the temper of the council in an instant. "Ships have gathered in Umbar," he reported. "Not merchants, but war vessels. Their sails fill the harbor like a forest before a storm." Silence settled over the chamber, as every captain understood what such news might mean. The quiet years of preparation were ending, and the House of Hurin would soon learn whether vigilance alone could preserve the realm against enemies who had finally chosen to strike. The messenger from the southern coast had scarcely finished speaking before the council chamber stirred with urgent voices. Lords who only moments before had debated the repair of roads now leaned over maps of the Bay of Belfalas, measuring distances with anxious hands. Umbar had long been a place of bitter memory for Gondor, its proud harbor held by descendants of the king's men who had turned against the heirs of Elendil generations before. Their captains had never abandoned the dream of weakening Gondor whenever opportunity appeared. Mardil allowed every lord to speak before raising his hand for silence. "We prepared because this day would come," he said. "If we abandon calm now, then all our years of labor have been wasted." Couriers departed before sunrise in every direction. Their horses changed at each relay, so no precious hour would be lost. Orders reached Pelagia, where the greatest harbor of Gondor bustled with fishermen, traders, and warships resting at anchor beneath the city's stone quays. The harbor master, a broad-shouldered veteran named Hallis, read the steward's seal and immediately set the docks into motion. Sailmakers worked through the night repairing canvas, while blacksmiths sharpened boarding axes and fitted new iron to anchor chains. Bells rang across the waterfront as crews returned from their homes to prepare vessels that had not tasted battle in many years. The smell of fresh tar, wet rope, and sea salt drifted through the harbor until every street echoed with purposeful labor. Mardil himself rode south with a chosen company, crossing the fertile lands of Lebanon, where vineyards stretched across gentle hills and orchards promised another generous harvest. Farmers looked up from their work as the steward's banner passed, sensing from the pace of the riders that troubling news had reached the capital. Few questions were asked. Men simply removed their caps in respect, while women gathered children close beside them, remembering old tales of corsair raids that had scarred these shores in years gone by. Mardil noticed every expression, and each reminded him that war was never confined to soldiers alone. It reached every home long before the first sword was drawn. When the steward entered Pelargir, he found the city transformed by disciplined urgency rather than panic. Dockworkers carried barrels of fresh water aboard waiting ships, while armorers inspected every rivet of helmets stacked upon wooden benches. Captains stood in circles studying tides, prevailing winds, and hidden shoals known only to experienced sailors. Hallas greeted Mardil beside the flagship with a respectful bow. "The fleet is not as large as in the days of the kings," he admitted, "but every vessel we possess is ready." Mardil looked over the forest of masts rising against the bright morning sky. "Numbers matter," he answered, "yet resolve often matters more. Let our enemies discover both." A swift galley arrived before noon, bearing scouts who had shadowed the corsair fleet from a safe distance. Their commander spread a chart across the deck, securing its corners against the wind with polished stones. "They gather beyond the cape," he explained, tracing the coastline with a weathered finger. "Nearly 40 ships, perhaps more hidden farther south. They are waiting for favorable winds before sailing north." Several younger officers exchanged uneasy glances. Hallas frowned, but remained composed. "If they sail together, they could strike many harbors before we intercept them." Mardil folded his arms. "Then we shall deny them surprise. Every beacon along the coast must be watched from this night onward." The following days passed beneath restless skies as Gondor's fleet left Pelargir in measured groups rather than as one great armada. Some ships guarded the mouths of rivers where villages stood exposed, while others patrolled farther offshore, forcing the corsairs to remain uncertain of Gondor's strength. Mardil approved this strategy despite knowing it divided his forces. "If they seek one battle, we shall offer them many obstacles instead," he told Hallas during an evening council aboard the flagship. The old captain smiled faintly. "You think like a man defending a kingdom rather than winning glory." The steward returned the smile. "Glory feeds no family after the war is over." Several days later, dense morning fog covered the bay of Belfalas so completely that even nearby vessels appeared as pale shadows upon the water. Sailors spoke in low voices, listening for sounds hidden beyond the mist. Then the sharp blast of a warning horn rolled across the sea, followed by another farther to the west. Men rushed to their stations as lookouts finally caught glimpses of dark sails emerging through the whiteness. The corsairs had advanced under cover of the fog, hoping to fall upon isolated patrols before alarms could spread. Hallas drew his sword with practiced calm. "Now they show their true purpose," he said. Mardil tightened his grip upon the rail as the first enemy ships became visible. "Then let Gondor answer." The battle that followed was fierce, but carefully fought. Gondorian captains avoided reckless charges, using the wind to keep their ships supporting one another while denying the corsairs easy opportunities to surround them. Arrows hissed across the water, striking shields and sails with equal violence as drums thundered from opposing decks. Grappling hooks flew through the air whenever ships drifted too close, pulling hull against hull until warriors met with sword and axe upon slippery planks stained by seawater and blood. Mardil fought beside ordinary marines after enemy boarders gained the flagship's deck. He carried no jeweled weapon, only a well-balanced sword that had served him faithfully for many years. Those who witnessed the steward standing shoulder to shoulder with common soldiers remembered the sight long afterward. At the height of the struggle, A Gondorian lookout shouted that more enemy sails approached from the south. For one tense moment, every heart aboard the flagship grew heavy, believing hidden reinforcements had arrived. Hallis climbed the stern platform, narrowed his eyes against the glare, and suddenly laughed aloud. "Not theirs!" he cried. "Ours!" Fresh ships from Pelargir swept into the battle with favorable wind, filling their white sails, having followed beacon signals lit during the previous night. The Corsairs had expected scattered resistance. Instead, they found themselves caught between prepared squadrons whose captains had trained together for months before the enemy ever sailed. Their orderly attack dissolved into confusion. By late afternoon, the surviving Corsair vessels turned south, abandoning damaged ships to escape before the wind shifted again. Gondor did not pursue recklessly beyond familiar waters. Hallis wished to chase the fleeing enemy while they remained disorganized, but Mardil shook his head. "A wounded wolf still bites," he warned. "Our task is to secure these shores, not gamble upon distant seas." The old captain accepted the decision after a moment's reflection. Looking across the battered fleet, he understood that victory already belonged to Gondor without inviting unnecessary losses. News of the victory spread swiftly through the coastal provinces. Bells rang from Pelargir to Dol Amroth, while fishing villages welcomed weary sailors home with tears, songs, and tables laden with fresh bread and steaming stew. Yet Mardil refused celebrations that lasted too long. During a gathering of captains upon the docks, he addressed them plainly. The Corsairs have learned that Gondor remains watchful, but defeated enemies often return wiser than before. Repair every ship, replace every arrow, bury our dead with honor, then prepare as though another fleet already sails toward us. No man argued, for the battle had shown them how quickly peace could be broken. When the steward finally returned to Minas Tirith, the White Tower greeted him as it always had, standing serene above the city, despite the turmoil beyond its walls. The empty throne remained untouched within the Hall of the Kings, waiting through another year for a ruler who did not come. Mardil laid the white rod across his knees during the evening council and reflected upon the narrow escape won upon the sea. Gondor had preserved its southern lifeline, yet every victory carried a cost in weary faces and newly dug graves. As fresh reports arrived from the eastern marches describing renewed movement near the borders of Mordor, he understood that the realm had survived one trial only to find another already approaching from the shadows. The victory upon the sea brought Gondor a season of welcome relief, but it did not bring lasting safety. Along the eastern frontier, where the green woods of Ithilien gave way to the harsh lands beneath the Ephel-Duth, the watch never ceased. Riders came and went through the gates of Minas Tirith at every hour, their horses flecked with foam after long journeys over broken roads. Most bore reports of little consequence, wandering outlaws, wolves descending from the hills, or merchants requesting additional escorts. Then, before the first snows of another winter had melted, a messenger from Osgiliath arrived carrying tidings that caused every captain in the council chamber to fall silent. Strange bands of armed men had crossed the Anduin by night, not in great numbers, but often enough to trouble every village east of the river. Mardil unfolded the reports one after another, laying them across the long table until they formed a rough chain stretching from the northern crossings to the southern woods. None described a battle worthy of song. A shepherd had disappeared with his flock. A watchtower had found its signal fire cut apart before sunset. Hunters had glimpsed mailed figures retreating into the trees before patrols could overtake them. Captain Baranor rested his hand upon the map and spoke what every experienced soldier already suspected. These are not raids for plunder. Someone wishes to make Ithilien fear the night. Mardil nodded slowly. Fear empties a land more surely than fire. If our people abandon the frontier, the enemy will inherit it without lifting a sword. Within the week, the steward rode once more across the great bridge of Osgiliath. Though the city no longer served as the capital, it remained a marvel worthy of admiration, its broad avenues lined with ancient stonework that recalled the greatness of earlier kings. Merchants still crossed its markets each morning, and children played beside fountains carved generations before their grandfathers had been born. Yet the eastern districts had grown quieter over the years. Families increasingly preferred to settle farther west, away from the shadow creeping ever closer from Mordor. Mardil noticed shuttered houses standing empty beside homes, where gardens were still lovingly tended, and he understood that the struggle for Ithilien had already begun, long before swords were drawn. Baranor led the steward to one of the smaller forts, overlooking a wooded valley where several attacks had been reported. The commander greeted them with visible relief, for weeks had passed since he had seen another officer of rank. Over a simple evening meal of bread, smoked fish, and onions roasted over the fire, the commander described the pattern. "They strike only where they believe no soldiers wait," he explained. "By the time our riders arrive, they have vanished. We chase tracks until dawn, then find nothing but abandoned camps." A young lieutenant clenched his jaw in frustration. "Give me enough horsemen, my lord, and I shall hunt them into the mountains." Mardil looked steadily at the eager officer before answering. A hunter who forgets patience often becomes the prey. The following morning, the steward walked the forest paths himself with a small company of rangers. The woods of Ithilien remained beautiful, despite the unease settling over them. Sunlight filtered through oak and beech, birds sang from hidden branches, and clear streams flowed over polished stones as though untouched by war. Yet signs of careful movement revealed themselves to trained eyes. Broken twigs had been turned upright again to disguise fresh trails. Ashes from cooking fires had been buried beneath leaves. Even discarded footprints disappeared where branches had been used to brush away the softer earth. Baranor crouched beside one such place and looked toward the eastern hills. "Whoever teaches these men understands our ways." Mardil frowned. "Then we must become harder to deceive than they expect." Instead of sending larger patrols, the steward ordered smaller companies to spread across the forests, each familiar with a different section of the frontier. Local foresters joined the soldiers, bringing knowledge that maps could never provide. Hunters pointed out forgotten deer trails, hidden ravines, and narrow crossings where strangers almost always left traces despite their caution. Villagers were instructed to light particular lanterns in their windows if suspicious travelers appeared nearby, creating a quiet system of warning that required no beacon fires. It was slow work, demanding discipline rather than glory. But within weeks, the balance began to change. Gondor no longer searched blindly. It waited where the enemy least expected resistance. One moonless night, a ranger named Hirveg noticed an owl taking flight from a grove where no animal should have been disturbed at that hour. Rather than rushing forward, he signaled silently to the others. The patrol circled through the trees until they reached a narrow hollow where nearly 20 armed intruders rested beside carefully covered embers. They had intended to continue west before dawn, believing themselves unseen. Instead, Gondorian horns sounded from 3 directions at once. The raiders sprang to their feet in confusion, only to discover that every path of escape had already been blocked. Steel flashed beneath the stars as the brief fight erupted among the trees. The struggle lasted only minutes, for surprise favored Gondor instead of its enemies. Several raiders fell where they stood, while others fled deeper into the woods, only to meet waiting patrols. A handful surrendered after realizing escape had become impossible. When daylight came, Mardil questioned the prisoners himself. They spoke little, refusing to reveal who had sent them, though their accents betrayed origins far beyond Gondor's borders. One older captive finally laughed bitterly. "Kill us if you wish. Others will come." Mardil regarded him without anger. "Perhaps they will," he answered. "But they will find this land less welcoming than you did." The victory heartened the frontier settlements, yet the steward refused to mistake success for final triumph. He rode from village to village, speaking not from balconies, but beside wells, in market squares, and among fields where spring planting had begun. At one farm overlooking the river, a young father confessed what many had feared to say aloud. "My wife wishes to leave for Anorian," he admitted. "She fears our children will grow up hearing horns instead of birds." Mardil looked across the freshly turned earth, where green shoots already pushed through the soil. "If every family leaves," he said quietly, "then Gondor loses more than fields. It loses the people whose courage gives those fields meaning. I cannot promise that danger will vanish, but I promise you this: we shall not abandon you." The words spread farther than any written decree. Farmers who had packed their wagons delayed their journeys. Craftsmen repaired homes instead of selling them. Small villages organized watches alongside the soldiers, sharing responsibility rather than surrendering it entirely to distant garrisons. The steward had not inspired them with dreams of easy victory. He had simply shown that Gondor intended to stand beside them instead of retreating behind stronger walls. That quiet assurance proved stronger than many expected. Years passed in this manner, marked not by great campaigns, but by constant vigilance. Children born during Mardil's first days as steward now trained with spear and shield, while grey-haired veterans finally laid aside their armor after decades upon the frontier. The empty throne in Minas Tirith remained untouched, and each new year reminded the people that the House of Huorin ruled only as faithful guardians. Mardil himself had grown older, his hair turning almost completely silver, yet his resolve remained unchanged. Whenever he stood beneath the white tree at dusk, he would look east toward the mountains where King Eärnur had disappeared, wondering whether any living soul still remembered the face of Gondor's last king. At last, after many years of tireless service, the weight of age settled upon Mardil more heavily than armor ever had. One evening he summoned his eldest son to the quiet chamber overlooking the court of the fountain. The white rod rested across his lap as twilight gathered beyond the windows, and for a long while neither man spoke. Finally, Mardil broke the silence. "This burden was never meant to become an inheritance," he said softly. "Yet the years have made it so." His son listened without interruption, understanding that he was hearing not the command of a ruler, but the counsel of a father who had spent a lifetime preserving another man's throne. Outside, the fountain continued its gentle song beneath the stars, while within the white tower, the first steward prepared to pass the long watch into the hands of the next generation. The bells of Minas Tirith rang softly at dawn, not with the peal that announced victory or mourning, but with the measured cadence reserved for solemn ceremony. Word had spread through every level of the city that Mardil Voronwe, the first ruling steward, had surrendered the white rod after long years of faithful service. He had not claimed a crown, nor sought one in secret, and in all his years upon the seat of governance, he had never allowed himself to forget that another authority stood above his own, though its rightful bearer was absent. The people lined the streets in quiet respect as the old steward passed through the court of the fountain one final time. Many bowed their heads, not because a king departed, but because a servant had fulfilled his charge with unwavering honor. As the doors of the Hall of the Kings closed behind him, a chapter unlike any before it in Gondor's history reached its peaceful end. His son, Eredin, stepped forward to receive the white rod in the presence of the lords and captains of the realm. He was younger than many had expected, though no longer a youth, with dark hair touched by the first threads of grey, and a face marked more by careful thought than by easy confidence. Before him stood the empty throne, unchanged since the disappearance of Ernor decades earlier. Eredin approached it slowly, bowed deeply, and remained there for several moments without speaking. At last he turned to those assembled. "My father preserved what was entrusted to him," he said in a calm voice. "I can promise no more than the same labor, and no less." The simplicity of the words carried greater weight than any grand declaration. Mardil did not withdraw into comfort after laying aside his office. Though age no longer allowed him to ride the frontiers, he remained within the White City, advising only when asked, and refusing to interfere in matters now belonging to his son. More than once, Eredin climbed the winding stairs to his father's modest chambers after difficult counsels. The older man never offered commands. Instead, he asked questions that forced careful thought. "When two captains disagree," Mardil observed one evening, as rain tapped against the windows, "listen first to the one who speaks least. He has often spent longer considering his words." Eredin smiled faintly. "You always answer with another lesson." Mardil rested his hands upon his cane. "Because Gondor has enough rulers, it will always need wiser servants." The change in leadership came at a fortunate moment, for no great invasion troubled the borders during Eredin's first years. The roads remained busy with merchants carrying wool from Anorion, wine from Lebanon, and timber floated down the Anduin from the northern forests. In Minas Tirith, masons repaired weathered walls that had stood since the days of the kings, replacing cracked stones before they became dangerous. Reservoirs were cleaned, granaries enlarged, and storehouses inspected with almost tedious regularity. Some younger nobles quietly questioned whether such ordinary work truly suited the dignity of Gondor. Eredin heard their complaints without offense. "Strong walls are built long before they are needed," he replied. "Neglect never announces its arrival." One autumn morning, an elderly merchant from Pelargia requested an audience that surprised several members of the council. He brought no complaint against taxes, no dispute over trade, and no request for privilege. Instead, he laid several worn ledgers upon the council table. "These records go back 3 generations," he explained. "The harvests have grown less certain along the lower river. Floods have become harder to predict, and many dikes built in the days of the kings have begun to fail. Some lords dismissed the matter as one for local officials. Eredin, however, studied the faded pages carefully before asking, "If we ignore them another 10 years, how many fields will be lost?" The old merchant answered without hesitation. "Thousands." The steward closed the ledger. "Then we shall not wait 10 years." Engineers and stonemasons soon departed for the southern provinces, with wagons loaded full of tools, timber, and cut stone. Rather than merely repairing damaged embankments, they strengthened entire stretches of the river, where generations of wear had weakened the foundations. Local laborers worked beside royal craftsmen from sunrise until evening, often sharing simple meals upon the riverbank before returning to their tasks. The work demanded patience instead of heroism. Yet by the following spring, the floods that once threatened nearby farms flowed safely between reinforced banks. When harvest arrived, the grain stores filled beyond expectation. Many families never learned the names of those who had planned the improvements, but they remembered that the steward had acted before disaster forced his hand. Not every challenge could be answered with stone and timber. During Eredán's 8th year in office, rumors reached Minas Tirith that several lesser nobles in the southern fiefs had begun settling old rivalries by force rather than law. None openly defied the steward, yet armed retainers gathered around isolated manors, and caravans found themselves delayed by disputes that should never have concerned ordinary travelers. Captain Baranor, now grey-bearded after decades of service, frowned as he finished reading the reports. A kingdom divided by pride weakens itself more surely than one defeated in battle, Eredán agreed. Then we must settle this before swords make judges unnecessary. Instead of summoning the quarrelsome lords to Minas Tirith under threat, Eredán travelled south himself. His escort remained deliberately modest, large enough for safety, but too small to appear as an army. One by one, he visited the estates whose disputes had troubled the countryside. At the first gathering, harsh words quickly filled the hall before either side could present evidence. Eredán listened without interruption until both men had exhausted their anger. Only then did he rise from his chair. "Your fathers fought beside one another against the enemies of Gondor," he said quietly. "Must their sons now waste that loyalty, arguing over fields no enemy has yet conquered?" The room fell silent, not because every grievance vanished, but because neither lord could deny the truth of his words. The negotiations continued for nearly 3 weeks. Old boundary stones were uncovered where vines had hidden them for years. Witnesses whose memories stretched back half a lifetime were questioned with patient care. More than once, the steward walked disputed fields himself, measuring streams and hills exactly as earlier records described them. The process proved slow, and several captains privately wished for quicker solutions. Yet when agreements were finally reached, they endured because both sides had been heard rather than merely commanded. As Eredán mounted his horse to depart, one elderly landholder bowed deeply and said, "Justice travels more slowly than anger, my lord, but it remains long after anger has ridden away." Back in Minas Tirith, Mardil listened with quiet satisfaction as his son described the journey. The old steward's hands trembled now even while lifting a cup of warm broth, and climbing the tower stairs had become a labor that required frequent rests. Still, his mind remained clear. "You chose the harder road," he observed. Eredán nodded. "For a time I feared it was also the slower one." Mardil smiled gently. "It often is. Yet kingdoms are seldom preserved by the quickest answer." Those words remained with Eredán long after his father retired for the evening. Winter returned to Gondor beneath clear skies, and sharp winds blowing from the White Mountains. The realm stood peaceful, its harvest secure, its roads open, and its borders quiet. Yet Eredán knew such seasons never lasted forever. He often stood upon the eastern walls after sunset, gazing toward the dark line of the Ephel Duath, where the shadow still lingered in Minas Morgul. Somewhere beyond those mountains, patient enemies watched the passing years as carefully as Gondor itself. The stewards had preserved the kingdom through diligence rather than glory, but every generation understood that one neglected warning could undo decades of faithful labor. And before many more years had passed, the next trial would come not from the sea or the forests, but from a sickness no sword could overcome. The first signs were so ordinary that few men paid them any heed. A farmer from the southern Vales arrived in Pelagier with a fever after several weeks upon the river, and the healers believed he had merely exhausted himself beneath the summer sun. Within days, however, 2 dock workers who had unloaded his cargo fell ill with the same burning sickness. Soon afterward, a merchant caravan traveling north carried reports that entire households in villages along the Anduin had been struck by an unfamiliar malady. No army marched against Gondor, no hostile banner appeared upon the horizon, yet fear spread more swiftly than any mounted host could have ridden. The steward understood before many others did that this was an enemy no fortress wall could keep outside. Messengers hurried from province to province, carrying sealed instructions rather than calls to arms. Eredin ordered every healer of skill to travel where the need was greatest, while monasteries, noble households, and city infirmaries opened their doors to the sick regardless of rank. Storehouses that had been filled through years of careful planning now proved their worth. Grain was distributed freely to villages whose fields had been abandoned because entire families lay too weak to harvest them. A starving people cannot recover, the steward reminded his council. Feed them first. Count the cost afterward. None disputed the command, for every day brought darker news than the last. Within Minas Tirith itself, the streets slowly changed. Markets that had once overflowed with merchants and customers now stood strangely quiet, their stalls occupied by only a handful of traders who kept a cautious distance from one another. The sound of blacksmiths' hammers became less frequent as apprentices fell ill beside their masters. Even the laughter of children seemed to vanish from the narrow lanes climbing toward the citadel. Physicians walked from house to house, carrying satchels filled with herbs, linen, and whatever remedies long experience had taught them, though many confessed in private that little eased the suffering once the fever had fully taken hold. Every sunrise revealed more shuttered windows than the one before. Eredin refused to remain behind the walls of the citadel, while others bore the burden alone. Accompanied by only a few trusted guards and the chief healer of the city, he visited infirmaries established within guild halls, monasteries, and even abandoned warehouses converted into places of care. The smell of fresh herbs mingled with smoke from countless braziers where water boiled day and night. Men and women moved quietly among rows of cots, offering water to cracked lips, changing cool cloths, and whispering encouragement to those still strong enough to hear. A young healer looked up as the steward entered and bowed hastily. "My lord," she said, "we lack hands more than medicine." Eredin removed his cloak, rolled back his sleeves, and answered simply, "Then today I have 2 hands to lend." For hours he carried water, helped lift the weakest patients, and listened as frightened families asked questions no ruler could honestly answer. An elderly man grasped his wrist with surprising strength and whispered, "Will Gondor survive this?" The steward hesitated only a heartbeat before replying, "Yes. Not because we are spared sorrow, but because we endure it together." The old man closed his eyes with a weary nod, seemingly comforted less by certainty than by the quiet conviction in Eredin's voice. As evening settled outside, the steward left the infirmary carrying a heavier heart than when he had entered. He knew that courage could strengthen hope, but it could not always preserve life. The sickness spread unevenly across the realm. Some villages escaped with only a few cases, while others lost so many people that neighboring settlements gathered their harvests before the grain spoiled in abandoned fields. Along the southern roads, wagons laden with food replaced caravans carrying luxury goods. Soldiers who normally guarded frontier forts now escorted physicians and supplies through districts where too few healthy men remained to ensure safe passage. Captain Baranor, though advanced in years, personally supervised many of these journeys. One evening, beside a roadside fire, he remarked, "In all my years, I have never seen an enemy that leaves every sword in its sheath." Eredan stared into the flames before answering, "Nor one that demands greater discipline." As the months passed, some members of the council urged the steward to withdraw entirely into the citadel until the sickness had run its course. They argued that Gondor could not risk losing both its ruler and its most experienced officers. Eredan listened respectfully before rising from his chair. "If I ask fathers to remain beside their children and healers beside their patients," he said, "then I cannot hide behind stone while others accept the danger I refuse." The chamber fell silent. No further objections were offered, though several councillors exchanged worried glances. They admired his resolve, even as they feared its cost. Autumn winds finally brought cooler air from the White Mountains, and with them came the first signs that the sickness had begun to loosen its grip. The number of new cases slowly diminished. Villages that had feared complete ruin cautiously reopened their markets, while church bells once again rang for weddings instead of funerals. Yet the scars remained everywhere. Empty houses stood beside occupied ones. Workshops lacked craftsmen whose tools would never again ring upon the anvil. Fields carefully planted in spring now lay partly untended, because too few hands remained to gather every harvest. Gondor had survived, but survival carried a solemn price. During the first council, held after the danger had largely passed, Eredan ordered a complete accounting of every province, not for taxes nor for military strength, but to discover where help remained most urgently needed. Orphans were placed under the protection of extended families or the great households of the realm. Farms left without heirs were entrusted temporarily to neighboring villages, so that fertile land would not fall into neglect. Storehouses emptied by months of relief were immediately refilled, while the harvest still allowed it. "Recovery begins before grief has ended," the steward reminded his officials. "If we wait for perfect peace, we shall never rebuild." That winter, Mardil's health declined more rapidly than it had before. The old steward had escaped the sickness itself, yet the years now claimed their due with quiet persistence. Eredan visited him almost every evening, often finding his father seated beside the window, overlooking the court of the fountain. They spoke less of politics than they once had. Instead, they remembered old companions, campaigns along the frontier, and the early days when the office of the ruling steward had still been something entirely new. One evening, Mardil smiled faintly as snow drifted across the courtyard below. "The realm has endured another trial," he murmured. "Not because one man was strong enough to save it, but because many refused to abandon one another." Only a few weeks later, the first ruling steward of Gondor passed peacefully before dawn. The White City mourned him with sincere affection rather than extravagant display. His body was laid to rest among the stewards in the House of the Kings, beneath the shadow of the citadel he had served for so many years. Soldiers stood in silent ranks, craftsmen left their workshops, and farmers from nearby valleys climbed the long road to pay their respects to the man who had governed without ever claiming a crown. As Eredan placed the white rod upon his father's tomb for a single moment before taking it up once more, he understood that the burden had truly become his alone. Beyond the eastern mountains, however, time continued its patient march, and the enemies of Gondor had not forgotten the kingdom whose watch had now passed fully into the hands of a new generation. The years flowed onward like the broad waters of the Anduin, carrying one generation into the next, without haste and without pause. Eredan's stewardship settled into a pattern of steady labor that rarely found its way into songs, yet the kingdom prospered because of it. Harvests returned to abundance after the years of sickness. Villages once emptied by grief welcomed new families, and the roads again filled with traders whose wagons creaked beneath wool, wine, grain, and finely worked iron. To many across Gondor, peace had become ordinary once more. The steward knew better. Peace, he often reminded his council, was never a gift that remained unattended. It was a field that required constant tending, lest weeds take root unnoticed. One morning, a delegation arrived from the northern reaches of Anorion, requesting aid for a problem that seemed insignificant beside wars and plagues. Heavy rains during several successive winters had weakened the old stone road leading toward Osgiliath, and portions of the ancient causeway had begun to collapse into marshy ground. Several younger councillors suggested postponing repairs until more pressing matters arose. Eredan listened patiently before asking a single question. How many soldiers can reach the eastern frontier if the road fails entirely? No one answered immediately. At last, an engineer spoke. Far fewer than before, my lord. The steward nodded. Then the road is not merely stone, it is part of our shield. Hundreds of craftsmen departed Minas Tirith before the month had ended. Masons carefully dismantled unstable sections before rebuilding them upon stronger foundations, while carpenters erected temporary bridges so merchants could continue their journeys without interruption. Soldiers worked alongside laborers, hauling stone from nearby quarries and reinforcing embankments against future floods. The work drew little notice beyond those who traveled the route, yet it quietly strengthened Gondor's ability to answer danger wherever it might arise. Baranor, now stooped with age but still sharp of mind, watched the laborers from a hillside one afternoon. No bard will sing of this, he remarked with a faint smile. Eredan looked over the busy roadway below. Then let future generations travel safely because no song was needed. As the steward's own hair slowly silvered, younger officers rose to command the frontier garrisons. Among them was a captain named Halakar, whose courage had already become well known throughout Ithilien. Unlike many ambitious men, Halakar measured success not by victories won, but by disasters prevented. During his first audience with the steward, he spread detailed sketches of the eastern woods across the council table. The enemy seldom strikes where we expect, he explained. They watch our habits. We must change them before they learn them. Eredan studied the maps carefully before smiling with quiet approval. You remind me of Captain Baranor when he was your age. That is praise I offer rarely. Halakar soon reorganized the patrols throughout Ithilien. Instead of riding fixed routes that enemies could easily observe, the companies varied their movements from week to week. Hidden supply caches were established deep within friendly forests, allowing patrols to remain in the field longer without relying upon predictable roads. Rangers familiar with every stream and hillside trained newly arrived soldiers in the patient craft of watching without revealing themselves. Before long, reports reaching Minas Tirith described fewer successful incursions across the Anduin. The enemy still came, but they increasingly found Gondorian eyes waiting where no watch should have been. Late one autumn evening, Halakar arrived unexpectedly at the citadel, carrying a leather pouch sealed with wax. Inside lay several letters recovered from captured infiltrators who had attempted to cross the frontier, disguised as wandering traders. The writings revealed no grand strategy, yet they painted a troubling picture. Small bands from beyond Mordor had begun cooperating more closely with outlaws already hiding in the wilderness west of the mountains. Alone, neither group posed a grave threat. Together they could unsettle trade, frighten isolated settlements, and slowly weaken Gondor's confidence without risking open battle. Eredan folded the final letter and rested it upon the table. "A kingdom rarely falls all at once," he said quietly. "It is first taught to doubt itself." Rather than sending larger armies eastward, the steward chose a different course. Trusted officials traveled through the provinces, listening directly to village elders, merchants, foresters, and ferrymen whose daily work revealed changes long before formal reports reached the capital. Many problems proved simple enough to solve with local effort once they were properly understood. Bridges received stronger guards during market days, isolated farmsteads were linked by mounted patrols, and abandoned watchtowers were restored to service after years of neglect. The people gradually realized that their concerns reached the ears of Minas Tirith, even when no great crisis demanded attention. That confidence became another unseen wall protecting the realm. During one journey through Ithilien, Eredan stopped beside a small vineyard overlooking the Anduin. Its owner, an elderly vintner whose family had cultivated the same hillside for generations, welcomed the steward with fresh bread, olives, and a cup drawn from the previous autumn's harvest. As they overlooked the river together, the old man spoke with quiet honesty. "Many times we have considered leaving. Each spring we tell ourselves that the danger grows nearer, yet each year your patrols return. And so we remain." Eredan turned his gaze toward the eastern bank where mist drifted among the trees. "It is you who keep Ithilien alive," he replied. "Soldiers defend the land, but families give it purpose." Winter arrived early that year, bringing heavy snow even to the lower valleys. The roads remained open only through constant labor as work crews cleared drifts, while soldiers escorted caravans carrying food between the provinces. One evening, a blizzard trapped several dozen travelers within an isolated wayhouse north of Osgiliath. Halakar personally led a rescue party through the storm after local shepherds reported the missing caravan. They reached the travelers at dawn, exhausted but alive, and guided them safely back to shelter. When news reached Minas Tirith, Eredan commended the captain before the assembled council. Halakar merely bowed. "We did only what duty required," he answered. The steward smiled. "Then may Gondor always be served by men who think duty worthy of no praise." The passing years gradually claimed many who had stood beside Mardil during the earliest days of the stewards. Captain Baranor at last laid aside his sword after nearly a lifetime spent defending the realm. His hands had grown too unsteady for the bow, though his mind remained as clear as ever. Before retiring to his family's estate in Lossarnach, he requested one final audience with Eredan. The two men stood together upon the eastern walls, where they had watched countless dawns over the years. "When I was young," Baranor said softly, "I believed kingdoms survived because great captains won famous battles. I have lived long enough to learn otherwise." Eredan looked toward the empty plains beyond the river. "And what have you learned?" The old soldier rested both hands upon the worn stone parapet. "That kingdoms endure because ordinary days are governed wisely." Not long afterward, Baranor passed from the circles of the world, and Gondor honored him as one of its most faithful servants. Yet even as old companions departed, younger men continued taking their places upon the walls, in the courts, and along the frontiers. Such was the rhythm of the steward's long watch. No generation could preserve Gondor forever. Each could only strengthen it enough that those who followed might inherit a realm still standing. As another spring brightened the white mountains with melting snows, Eredan gazed once more upon the empty throne within the Hall of the Kings. Decades had passed since Eärnur had ridden into darkness, and still no rightful heir had appeared. The white rod remained steady in the steward's hand, but deep within his heart he wondered how many more generations would bear it before the king at last returned. Years became decades, and decades quietly yielded to new generations. Eredin's hair turned white, and the young officers who had once sought his approval now commanded provinces of their own. Children born during his earliest days as steward grew into seasoned captains, while their own sons began learning the histories of Gondor beneath the shadow of the White Tower. The empty throne in the Hall of the Kings remained untouched, polished with the same care as in the days of Ernor, for the stewards never allowed dust or neglect to settle upon the symbol of the realm they guarded. Visitors from distant lands often paused before it in silence, struck by the sight of a kingdom that still prepared each day for the return of a king no living man had seen. Eredin would sometimes stand there alone after the council had ended, wondering whether those yet unborn would inherit the same solemn duty. When at last Eredin felt the weight of years pressing more heavily upon him than the white rod itself, he summoned his eldest son to the citadel. The meeting took place not in the great council chamber, but beside the white tree, whose bare branches still stretched toward the heavens with quiet dignity. Father and son walked slowly around the fountain as evening settled across Minas Tirith, listening to the gentle sound of falling water. "Our family has ruled for many years," Eredin said, "yet never forget that we possess nothing which is truly ours. We hold everything in trust." His son bowed his head in understanding. "Then I shall guard that trust as faithfully as I am able." Eredin placed one hand upon his shoulder. "That is all Gondor has ever asked of us." The white rod passed once again from father to son without dispute or ceremony, beyond the ancient customs established by Mardil himself. So another steward took up the burden, followed in time by another after him, and then another still. Their names were carefully entered into the records preserved within the archives of Minas Tirith, each succeeding the last in an unbroken line descending from the House of Hurin. Some governed for many years, others for only a short time, but all inherited the same charge: to preserve Gondor until the king returned. None claimed the royal title. None placed a crown upon his head. The white rod remained their only emblem of authority, reminding every steward that he governed not in his own right, but as the keeper of another's realm. The long peace that followed allowed Gondor to strengthen itself in ways unseen by neighboring kingdoms. Roads extending from Minas Tirith to Pelargir received new paving stones where centuries of wagons had worn deep ruts into the surface. Bridges were widened to allow armies and merchants alike to pass without delay. Watchtowers overlooking the Anduin were rebuilt with stronger foundations, while Beacon Hills received fresh stores of timber every year, regardless of whether danger seemed near. Master builders restored aging walls throughout the provinces before cracks could widen into ruin. Such work demanded patience more than brilliance. Yet generation after generation, the stewards understood that neglected kingdoms seldom required an enemy to destroy them. Trade flourished during these years. Merchant ships sailed regularly between Pelargir and the southern coasts, carrying grain, timber, wine, and finely crafted goods to distant ports. The fertile lands of Lebanon yielded generous harvests, while shepherds in Anorion drove healthy flocks across broad green pastures each spring. Markets within Minas Tirith became gathering places where travelers from Dol Amroth, Lossarnach, Pinathgelin, and the northern Vales exchanged both goods and news. Although the shadow still lingered in Minas Morgul, Many ordinary folk knew it only through stories told by aging veterans beside evening fires. The stewards never discouraged such prosperity, but neither did they permit comfort to dull the vigilance of the realm. Every new steward followed a custom begun by Mardil. Soon after assuming office, he journeyed throughout Gondor instead of remaining within the White City. Some rode the western hills overlooking Belfalas. Others visited the fishing villages lining the mouths of the Anduin, while still others traveled deep into the forests bordering Ithilien. They listened far more than they spoke. A ferryman might explain how changing currents threatened an important crossing. A miller could point to declining grain yields before any tax collector noticed them. Rangers described subtle changes within the eastern woods, where unfamiliar tracks appeared after years of quiet. Through such conversations, the stewards came to understand that a kingdom revealed its true condition not in council halls, but among its people. One summer, a steward traveling through the southern fiefs stopped beside a small stone bridge where several laborers struggled to repair flood damage after unusually heavy rains. The foreman apologized for delaying the steward's procession and ordered his men to clear the road immediately. Instead, the steward dismounted and examined the broken foundation himself. "How long has this bridge stood?" he asked. The foreman wiped sweat from his brow before answering. "Nearly 200 years, my lord." The steward knelt beside the cracked stone. "Then let us rebuild it, so that it stands 200 more." For the remainder of that afternoon, he remained with the workers, discussing stronger foundations and better drainage, rather than hurrying toward the next formal reception awaiting him. Though years of peace blessed Gondor, the stewards never ignored the eastern frontier. Rangers still crossed Ithilien, beneath the cover of darkness, watching the lands near Minas Morgul, where no honest traveler willingly lingered. Reports continued to arrive, describing scattered bands of orcs, spies, and wandering evil men moving through the wilderness before vanishing again into the mountains. Rarely did these intruders gather insufficient strength to threaten the kingdom directly, yet their persistence reminded every captain that the shadow had not departed. New recruits trained throughout the year, regardless of whether war seemed distant. Veterans instructed them in discipline before swordplay, teaching that a careless watchman endangered an entire province. Within the archives of Minas Tirith, scribes devoted themselves to preserving every record left by earlier generations. They copied fading scrolls, repaired damaged chronicles, and carefully updated the long rolls listing every steward since Mardil. Young apprentices often paused before those records in quiet admiration. "Will there always be stewards?" one asked, an elderly archivist, while replacing a weathered volume upon its shelf. The old man smiled thoughtfully before answering. "No office created by men lasts forever. We simply do not know when its purpose will be fulfilled." The apprentice glanced toward the distant hall of the kings, where the empty throne waited as patiently as ever. Outside the walls, seasons continued their endless procession. Spring clothed the fields with green, summer ripened vineyards beneath warm sunlight, autumn filled the granaries, and winter laid snow upon the white mountains. Children who played beside the fountains of Minas Tirith eventually stood guard upon its walls, while gray-haired soldiers quietly retired to lives of farming or craftsmanship after decades of faithful service. The stewards themselves came and went, each laying down the white rod before another took it up. Through all those changing years, Gondor endured because every generation accepted responsibility before seeking honor. The kingdom seemed as steady as the mountains surrounding it, yet history had not finished testing the House of Hurin. Far to the east, beyond the Ephel Duath, the ancient fortress of Minas Morgul remained cloaked in silence. but silence could conceal many things. Travelers passing near the borders began speaking of increased movement beneath moonless skies, while rangers discovered fresh trails where none had appeared for years. Scouts occasionally glimpsed dark shapes, crossing distant ridges before disappearing among the rocks. The reports remained uncertain, and none alone suggested immediate danger, yet together they formed a pattern that experienced captains found difficult to dismiss. Once again, the stewards found themselves looking eastward, sensing that the patient enemy beyond the mountains had begun to stir after a long and watchful sleep. Generations passed beneath the shadow of the White Tower, and the House of Hurin continued its long vigil with remarkable constancy. Steward succeeded steward as fathers entrusted the white rod to their sons, and each man swore the same unspoken oath that Mardil had first embraced. Gondor would be preserved, whatever years or trials might come, until the king returned. The names of those rulers filled long scrolls in the archives of Minas Tirith: Beleg, Hurin I, Turin I, Hador, Barahir, Dior, Denethor I, Boromir, Sirion, Halas, and many others, each remembered not for claiming greatness, but for preventing disaster. Some governed during quiet years when fields yielded generous harvests and trade enriched the realm. Others faced dangers that threatened to undo the labor of centuries, yet none forgot that they ruled only in trust. Among those stewards, Cirion proved one of the most heavily burdened. During his days, Gondor no longer possessed the strength it had enjoyed in earlier centuries, though it remained the greatest kingdom of men in the West. Many fortresses still stood proudly along its borders, but fewer soldiers filled their walls than in the time of the kings. Reports from the north became increasingly troubling as hostile Easterlings gathered beyond the river Anduin, while orcs multiplied in the misty mountains and raiding parties appeared with alarming frequency. One evening, as Sirion studied maps spread across the council table, Captain Borlas spoke with unusual frankness. "We have courage enough," he said quietly. "What we lack are the numbers to defend every frontier at once." The steward rested both hands upon the table. "Then we must decide which frontier, if lost, endangers them all, or to rest." The answer soon revealed itself. Messengers rode into Minas Tirith with exhausted horses and worn faces, bringing news that the Balcoth, fierce Easterling tribes, had crossed the Anduin in great strength and swept into the wide lands of Calenardon. Villages burned behind them, watchtowers fell silent one after another, and the defenders found themselves driven steadily westward. Unlike the scattered raiders of earlier generations, these invaders came not merely to plunder, but to conquer. They traveled with wagons, families, and great herds, intending to settle the lands they seized. Sirion listened without interruption as each messenger delivered his account. When the last had finished, silence settled over the chamber until the steward finally spoke. "If Calenardon falls, the road to the heart of Gondor lies open." The army assembled with remarkable speed, though every captain knew it was smaller than the danger demanded. Companies marched from Anorion, Losanak, and Lebanon, while riders from the southern fiefs hurried north to reinforce the host. Sirion rode among them, not as a distant commander, but as a leader, determined to see the struggle with his own eyes. As the army crossed the familiar roads toward the north, he saw abandoned farmsteads standing beside fields where grain had ripened without anyone left to gather it. Smoke still rose from ruined villages in the distance, carried upon a bitter wind from the plains. Young soldiers glanced toward the dark columns with uneasy expressions. An older veteran quietly tightened the straps of his shield and said, "Remember what waits behind us. That is why we stand." The Gondorian host reached the field of Celebrant, only to discover that the situation had become far graver than expected. The Balcoth had already forced the defenders toward the river Limelight, and fresh enemy companies continued arriving from the east. From a low hill, Sirion surveyed the plain where thousands of warriors moved beneath unfamiliar banners. Dust hung over the battlefield, dimming the afternoon sun until the entire valley seemed wrapped in a dull brown haze. Captain Borlas lowered his spyglass with a troubled expression. "If we attack alone, we shall likely hold them for a day," he admitted. "Perhaps two." Sirion looked across the river, where weary Gondorian companies struggled to maintain their lines. "Then we must hope that one day is enough." The battle began beneath gathering clouds as Gondor's cavalry charged to relieve the hard-pressed defenders along the riverbank. Spears splintered, horses screamed, and shields crashed together with deafening force. Again and again, the Stewards' soldiers drove into the enemy ranks, buying precious time, but paying dearly for every yard gained. Sirion fought near the center, where the pressure proved greatest, encouraging weary men whose armor had become stained with mud and blood alike. By late afternoon, even the bravest captains recognized that exhaustion threatened to accomplish what enemy swords had not. The Balcoth continued pressing forward in overwhelming numbers, while Gondor's reserves steadily disappeared into the struggle. Then, from the north, the sound of countless horns echoed across the open fields. At first, few understood what they heard. Men paused amid the fighting, straining to catch the distant call carried upon the wind. Moments later, riders appeared upon the horizon, descending from the north like a sudden storm sweeping across the plains. Their horses ran with astonishing speed, their long spears glittered beneath breaks in the cloud, and their voices rose in a great cry that rolled across the battlefield. The Balcoth hesitated in confusion as the newcomers struck their exposed flank with irresistible force. Captain Borlas stared in amazement before shouting above the noise, "Horsemen! Allies!" Sirion felt hope surge through the weary ranks for the first time that day. The riders were the Eothiod, led by their lord, Eol the Young. Answering the desperate summons that Sirion had sent far to the north, they had ridden with astonishing speed across many leagues, reaching the battlefield at the very moment Gondor stood upon the edge of defeat. Their charge shattered the Balcoth formation, driving the invaders away from the river before they could recover their order. Gondorian infantry advanced beside the horsemen, pressing the enemy relentlessly until the plain belonged once more to the defenders. By sunset, the invasion had become a rout. Those Balcoth who escaped fled eastward, abandoning the hope of conquering Calenardon. When the fighting ended, Sirion sought out Eol amid the weary but victorious armies. The young lord removed his helm, revealing a face blackened with dust and marked by the strain of the long ride. For a moment, neither man spoke, both looking over the field where so many had given their lives to preserve Gondor. At last, Sirion extended his hand. "You came when all hope seemed lost," he said. Eol accepted the greeting with quiet dignity. "Your message reached us," he replied. "No friend worthy of the name ignores such a call." The simple exchange marked the beginning of one of the greatest friendships in the history of the West. Several days later, after the wounded had been tended and the fallen buried with honor, Sirion led Eol to the sacred height of the Halathirion. There, far from the noise of the army, the steward offered the broad province of Calenardon to the Eothiod in gratitude for their aid, and in recognition that Gondor could no longer defend those vast northern plains alone. Eol accepted the gift with solemn humility, and together they swore an oath of everlasting friendship between their peoples. That pledge remembered ever afterward as the Oath of Eorl, bound Gondor and the newly founded Kingdom of Rohan together through all the years that followed. As the two leaders descended the hillside beneath the evening sky, neither could foresee how often that oath would one day save both realms from ruin, nor how deeply the destiny of the Stewards of Gondor would become entwined with the Riders of the Mark. The alliance forged between Gondor and the new Kingdom of Rohan transformed the fortunes of both realms. The broad plains of Calenardon, once difficult for Gondor to defend with its dwindling population, soon echoed with the thunder of the horses of the Rohirrim. Villages sprang up where abandoned watchposts had once stood, and the long grasslands again became a living frontier instead of an empty shield. Messengers rode regularly between Edoras and Minas Tirith, carrying news, requests, and greetings, rather than desperate pleas for aid. The Stewards never regarded the gift of the land as a loss. They understood that a loyal ally guarding the northern approaches was worth more than a province that Gondor no longer possessed the strength to protect alone. In the years that followed, the White Rod passed from one steward to another as steadily as the seasons turned. Each man inherited a realm preserved by the wisdom of those before him, yet each also discovered that new dangers always emerged where old ones had faded. Some years were remembered for generous harvests, flourishing trade, and peaceful borders. Others brought floods that damaged bridges, harsh winters that delayed supplies, or scattered raids from enemies probing Gondor's vigilance. The chronicles devoted little space to these quieter struggles, yet they occupied much of every steward's life. Great kingdoms seldom endured because of extraordinary moments alone. They survived because ordinary duties were performed faithfully every day. Centuries after Cirian's oath with Eorl, the office of steward came into the hands of a man whose name would be remembered long after many kings of lesser realms had been forgotten. His name was Denethor I, and he ruled during years when the shadow gathering in the east had begun to reveal itself more openly. Rumors spread that an evil power had returned to the dark fortress of Dol Guldur in southern Mirkwood. Though few yet understood its true nature, travelers increasingly vanished along northern roads, orcs grew bolder in the mountains, and strange creatures appeared in wilderness where they had not been seen for generations. Denethor received each report with careful attention, refusing to dismiss even the smallest warning. Darkness rarely announces its full strength, he told his council. It first tests whether those watching have grown careless. The steward strengthened the northern defenses, repaired aging fortifications, and increased the number of rangers patrolling Ithilien. Garrisons that had become accustomed to peaceful routine returned to stricter discipline. Officers rotated more frequently between frontier posts so that experience spread throughout the army, rather than remaining in a handful of veterans. Some nobles complained that these preparations placed unnecessary burdens upon the treasury. Denethor listened patiently before replying, "Gold hidden in vaults cannot defend a single village. Stone, steel, and trained men can." The council understood that he intended to spend Gondor's wealth preserving the kingdom rather than admiring it. The years justified his caution. Orcs descended more frequently from the Ephel Duath, striking isolated travelers before retreating into the hills. Bands of evil men crossed secretly through Ithilien, mapping roads and observing the movement of Gondorian patrols. Rangers intercepted many of these intruders before they accomplished their purpose, but every encounter revealed increasing organization among the enemies of the West. One weary captain returned from the frontier carrying maps taken from captured spies. Spreading them across the council table, he pointed toward several crossings of the Anduin, marked with surprising accuracy. "Someone studies us carefully," he warned. Denethor folded the maps without visible alarm. Then we shall study them more carefully still. One autumn evening, the steward climbed the eastern walls of Minas Tirith, accompanied only by the captain of the guard. Below them, the lamps of the city glowed warmly as families prepared their evening meals, while beyond the Pelennor fields, darkness slowly gathered across the distant plains. The captain rested both hands upon the parapet. "The people sleep peacefully tonight," he observed. Denethor looked toward the black silhouette of the mountains of shadow. "They should," he answered. "If they lose that peace, then we have already failed them." Neither man spoke again for several moments. The silence itself seemed to carry the weight of the long centuries during which the stewards had watched that eastern horizon. Denethor I did not live to witness the full danger he had long anticipated. During one campaign against orcs in Ithilien, he personally accompanied the army rather than directing operations from the safety of the capital. The fighting proved hard among wooded hills where visibility was poor and ambushes common. Gondor gained the field, but in the struggle the steward was struck by a poisoned arrow. His captains carried him from the battlefield, while physicians labored through the night to save his life. Denethor remained conscious long enough to issue his final commands, insisting that the pursuit continue so the enemy could not regroup. Before dawn he passed away, leaving the white rod to his son. His son, Boromir, accepted the office at a time when the shadow continued to lengthen across Middle-earth. Unlike many rulers suddenly burdened with unexpected authority, Boromir had spent years learning every aspect of governance beside his father. He knew the names of frontier commanders, the condition of distant roads, and the concerns of merchants whose trade sustained the realm. During his first council, one elderly lord expressed sympathy for the difficult inheritance now resting upon his shoulders. Boromir answered with quiet resolve. "Every steward inherits unfinished work. My task is no different from that of my fathers." Those present recognized the familiar spirit of the House of Hurin, which had always measured honor by service rather than comfort. Boromir's early years were marked by renewed cooperation with Rohan. Riders from the Mark frequently trained alongside Gondorian cavalry upon the fields west of Minas Tirith, exchanging tactics and strengthening the friendship established centuries earlier by Sirion and Eorl. Young soldiers from each realm listened eagerly to veterans recounting the ancient oath sworn upon the Halathirion, understanding that it remained more than a tale from the past. During one joint exercise, a marshal of Rohan laughed as Gondorian infantry stubbornly held a hill against repeated cavalry charges. "You men of stone refuse to move," he called cheerfully. A Gondorian captain grinned beneath his helmet. Someone must still be standing when the riders return. Good humor strengthened bonds that no treaty alone could have created. Yet even while friendship endured and the kingdom remained orderly, the signs of a greater storm multiplied. Reports arrived that the Nazgul had begun to stir once more, though few understood where they had gone or what purpose guided them. Travelers from the north carried troubling tales of growing unrest beyond the misty mountains, while Ithilien's rangers reported that creatures of the shadow ventured farther west with each passing year. Boromir stood one evening before the empty throne in the Hall of the Kings, its polished surface gleaming in the light of countless candles. More than 500 years had passed since Sirion's great oath, and nearly 1,000 since Mardil had first accepted the White Rod. Still, no king had returned, and still the stewards remained at their post. Beyond the eastern mountains, however, the Dark Lord was gathering his strength in secret, and the greatest trial the House of Hurin would ever face was drawing steadily nearer. the centuries that followed carried Gondor toward an age unlike any it had endured before. The line of the Stewards remained unbroken, yet each generation inherited a realm that demanded greater vigilance than the last. The Dark Tower of Barad-dûr had risen again, though few outside the councils of the wise fully understood the measure of the danger. From Minas Morgul, the servants of the enemy watched every movement along the Anduin, while orcs, Easterlings, and Southrons grew steadily bolder. The White City still shone proudly against the mountainside, but every captain upon its walls knew that the peace of earlier centuries had become only a memory carefully preserved. Among the later stewards, none earned greater renown than Turin II, whose long rule strengthened Gondor during difficult years. He ordered neglected fortresses repaired, expanded the training of the army, and restored discipline throughout the frontier garrisons. Riders traveled constantly between the beacon hills, ensuring that every signal station remained supplied and ready. Engineers reinforced the walls surrounding the Ramus Ekor, the great defensive wall protecting the Pelennor fields, while granaries throughout Anorion were enlarged against the possibility of siege. One evening, an officer remarked that such preparations seemed excessive during a season of relative calm. Turin looked toward the eastern horizon and answered quietly, "Our enemies decide when war begins, and we decide whether we are ready." The steward's foresight proved wise. Raids into Ithilien increased until many villages nearest the river could no longer be defended throughout the year. Rangers continued their patrols with remarkable courage, but they often found themselves facing enemies who crossed the Anduin in greater numbers than before. One weary commander returned after weeks in the field and spread a bundle of broken arrows before the council. "These were gathered from one skirmish," he said. 10 years ago, we would have found half as many." Turin examined the black feathered shafts in silence. "Then let every captain understand what they mean," he replied. "The shadow grows stronger, whether we acknowledge it or not." As the years passed, the office of steward eventually came into the hands of Ecthelion II, one of the wisest rulers the House of Hurin ever produced. Though burdened by constant threats, he possessed both keen judgment and an uncommon willingness to recognize ability wherever it appeared. During his reign, rumors reached Minas Tirith concerning a mysterious captain known as Thorongil, a man of noble bearing who had served with distinction in both Rohan and Gondor. He sought neither wealth nor title, asking only the opportunity to fight the enemies of the West. Ecthelion received him with cautious curiosity, studying the stranger during their first audience. "Many men speak boldly before battle," the steward observed. Thorongil met his gaze without arrogance. "Judge me after the battle instead." Thorongil soon justified the confidence placed in him. He led daring patrols into Ithilien, strengthened discipline among the frontier companies, and earned the respect of hardened veterans who rarely praised newcomers. Yet his greatest deed came when Ecthelion entrusted him with a perilous mission against the corsairs of Umbar. Their fleets had once again become a growing menace, threatening Gondor's southern coasts and the vital harbor of Pelargia. Thorongil proposed a bold strike before the corsairs themselves could sail north. Several captains doubted the plan, fearing that so small a force could never succeed against such a well-defended harbor. Ecthelion listened to every objection before turning to the captain. "If I approve this," he asked, "what do you require?" Thorongil answered simply, "Swift ships, disciplined men, and silence." The attack upon Umbar became one of the most celebrated victories of Ecthelion's reign. Under cover of darkness, Thorongil's force entered the harbor, destroyed many of the corsair ships at anchor, and escaped before the defenders could organize an effective pursuit. Flames illuminated the night sky as vessel after vessel burned upon the water, denying Gondor's enemies the fleet they had spent years assembling. When the victorious captain returned to Minas Tirith, the people greeted him with admiration, though he accepted their praise with remarkable restraint. Ecthelion offered him rich rewards and lasting honor within Gondor. Instead, Thorongil departed quietly not long afterward, leaving behind only gratitude, unanswered questions, and memories of extraordinary service. Few guessed that the mysterious captain had in truth been the hidden heir of Isildur, preparing for the destiny that still lay ahead. Not everyone within Minas Tirith welcomed Thorongil's growing reputation. Ecthelion's son, Denethor, possessed exceptional intelligence and unmatched knowledge of the realm, yet he watched the captain's rising fame with increasing unease. Denethor served faithfully beside his father, mastering every detail of governance, military command, and diplomacy. He seldom spoke carelessly, and those who underestimated him quickly discovered the sharpness of his mind. One evening, Ecthelion noticed his son's thoughtful silence after Thorongil had departed the council chamber. "You distrust him," the steward observed. Denethor answered carefully, "I distrust mysteries, father. A man who conceals his past usually conceals other things as well." When Ecthelion died after many years of faithful rule, Denethor became the 26th ruling steward of Gondor. He accepted the white rod with all the solemnity shown by his forefathers, bowing before the empty throne, just as Mardil had done nearly 1,000 years earlier. No crown adorned his brow, no proclamation declared him king. Before the assembled lords, he reaffirmed the ancient custom that the stewards governed only until the rightful heir should return. Yet those who knew Denethor understood that he inherited not only the authority of his office, but also the heaviest burden any steward had ever faced. Denethor proved a ruler of extraordinary ability. He strengthened every defense that Gondor still possessed, restored neglected armories, increased the training of the army, and maintained close friendship with Rohan through the reign of King Theoden's father, and later Theoden himself. He possessed remarkable insight into the movements of the enemy and often anticipated dangers before they became visible to others. Messengers found him already studying reports they had only just delivered, comparing them with older records preserved in the archives. "Patterns reveal what isolated events conceal," he told his captains more than once. His confidence inspired many, yet it also led him to shoulder responsibilities that few men could have endured without strain. In secret, Denethor also made use of one of the ancient Palantiri, preserved within Minas Tirith. The Seeing Stone allowed him to gather valuable knowledge concerning the movements of Mordor, and for a time, his strength of will enabled him to resist the influence seeking to dominate it. Through those hidden contests of mind, however, the Dark Lord gradually learned much about the steward himself. Though Sauron could not bend Denethor to obedience, he filled the visions with carefully chosen truths, revealing the enemy's immense strength while concealing every sign of hope. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the burden upon the steward's heart grew heavier. Outwardly, he remained the same commanding ruler his people admired. Inwardly, doubt and weariness began taking root where certainty had once stood. Then came the years immediately before the War of the Ring. Ithilien could no longer be permanently held, and the city of Osgiliath became the chief battleground between Gondor and the hosts of Mordor. Denethor's elder son, Boromir, won great honor defending the crossings of the Anduin, while his younger son, Faramir, proved himself among the finest captains of the Rangers of Ithilien. Father and sons served Gondor with unwavering devotion, each in his own manner. Yet even as they fought to preserve the realm, the enemy's armies gathered in numbers unseen since the end of the Second Age. The long watch begun by Mardil had reached its final and most perilous chapter, and before many more days had passed, the fate of the Stewards and of Gondor itself would be decided beneath the walls of Minas Tirith. The year came at last, when the long vigilance of the Stewards would be tested beyond anything their forefathers had imagined. From the eastern walls of Minas Tirith, great clouds could be seen gathering above Mordor, darkening the morning sky even before the armies themselves appeared. Messengers rode without rest between the outer defenses and the citadel, their horses collapsing from exhaustion after carrying tidings of advancing hosts. The beacon fires leaped from hill to hill across Gondor, answering one another until the White Mountains glowed through the night. In accordance with the ancient oath sworn by Cirion and Eorl, riders sped north toward Rohan, bearing the Red Arrow, calling upon the Horse Lords to fulfill the promise their ancestors had made centuries before. Denethor watched the final beacon blaze from the tower, knowing that everything preserved by the House of Hurin now rested upon the outcome of the days ahead. Within Minas Tirith, every citizen found a task. Smiths forged spearheads until the furnaces burned through the night, while women and older children stitched banners, repaired armor, and carried supplies to the walls. Bakers worked without pause, filling storehouses with bread for soldiers who might soon endure a long siege. Physicians prepared herbs, bandages, and medicines in halls already transformed into infirmaries. Along the battlements, Faramir inspected companies of weary defenders who had retreated from Ithilien only after delaying the enemy for as long as human strength allowed. One young soldier admitted quietly that he feared the countless armies marching from the east. Faramir rested a reassuring hand upon the man's shoulder. "Courage does not require the absence of fear," he said. "It asks only that we remain at our post despite it." The assault began with terrible force. Great engines hurled stones against the walls, while clouds of arrows darkened the air above the defenders. The earth shook beneath the advance of trolls, orcs, Easterlings, and Suthrons gathered from every corner of Sauron's dominion. The defenders answered with disciplined determination, loosing arrows from the battlements and hurling heavy stones upon ladders raised against the walls. Hour after hour, the struggle continued beneath smoke, fire, and the deafening roar of battle. Denethor moved tirelessly through the citadel, issuing orders with the calm precision that had marked his entire life. Yet every fresh report brought news of greater losses, and each messenger carried the weight of another hard-fought retreat. Then came the grievous wound of Faramir. After leading a desperate defense during the withdrawal from the Causeway forts, he returned to Minas Tirith carried upon a litter, burning with fever from the poisoned dart that had struck him. Denethor stood beside his unconscious son for a long time without speaking. Those present saw neither anger nor panic upon the steward's face, only a sorrow so profound that it seemed to age him within a single night. His long struggle through the Palantir had already filled him with visions of overwhelming armies and black ships sailing beneath the banners of the enemy. Now, seeing Faramir lying pale and unmoving, he believed that the last hope of his house had been extinguished. The burden he had carried alone for so many years finally became more than even his great strength could bear. Outside the city, however, events unfolded that Denethor could not see. Across the plains of the Pelennor, the horns of Rohan suddenly rang clear beneath the morning sky. King Theoden had honored the ancient oath without hesitation, leading the riders of the Mark to Gondor's aid, exactly as Eorl had promised long before. Their charge crashed into the enemy's ranks with overwhelming force, scattering companies that had believed victory already certain. Soon afterward, black-sailed ships appeared upon the Anduin, filling many defenders with despair as they assumed the corsairs had arrived. Then the foremost vessel unfurled the standard of the White Tree and the Seven Stars. Upon those ships came Aragorn the Second Elisar, accompanied by the men of southern Gondor, whom he had gathered on his march north. Hope, long hidden, entered the battle at the very moment despair seemed complete. Within the house of the Stewards, Denethor no longer perceived that hope. Believing all was lost, he carried Faramir into the silent street and entered the house of the Stewards, where generations of his ancestors rested. There, amid the tombs of Mardil, Sirion, Ecthelion, and all those who had faithfully guarded Gondor through the centuries, he prepared a funeral pyre for himself and his son. His servants pleaded with him to wait, insisting that the battle still continued beyond the walls. Denethor listened without conviction. Years of contest with Sauron through the Seeing Stone had shown him too much of the enemy's strength and too little of the hope that still remained. When help finally arrived in the person of Prince Imrahil, Gandalf, and Beregond of the Guard, Faramir was rescued from the flames. But Denethor, unwilling to abandon the course he had chosen, perished within the fire. So ended the rule of the last ruling steward. The battle beyond the city reached its victorious conclusion. The combined strength of Gondor and Rohan, together with Aragorn's arrival, drove Sauron's armies from the Pelennor fields. Yet the war itself had not ended. Aragorn understood that the Dark Lord's attention must be drawn away from the true danger approaching within Mordor. Leading the captains of the West, he marched to the Black Gate, where a small army stood against impossible odds to challenge Sauron openly. Their courage bought the final measure of time needed for two small hobbits to complete the task upon which all hope depended. Deep within the fires of Orodruin, the One Ring was destroyed, and with it, Sauron's power collapsed forever. The towers of Barad-dûr fell, the Nazgûl perished, and the long shadow that had threatened Gondor for countless generations passed away. When peace finally returned, the lords of Gondor assembled once more within the White City. The Hall of the Kings, silent for nearly 1,000 years, stood ready for a moment no steward had ever expected to witness with his own eyes. Aragorn entered wearing neither crown nor royal robes, but the weathered gear of a ranger who had wandered long in exile. Faramir, now healed through the skill of Aragorn's healing hands, approached carrying the white rod of the stewards. Before the assembled people, he knelt and offered it to the heir of Elendil. "The last steward of Gondor begs leave to surrender his office," he said with deep reverence. "For behold, one has come whose right is beyond all doubt." Aragorn received the rod with gratitude rather than triumph, and returned it at once. "That office is not ended," he replied. "You shall hold it and your descendants after you, while my line endures." Thus the house of Hurin remained honored, no longer ruling in place of the king, but serving beside him as it had always intended. Soon afterward, Aragorn was crowned king of the reunited kingdom as King Elessar. The White Tree blossomed anew within the court of the fountain after a living sapling was found upon the slopes of Mindolluin, a sign that the days of renewal had truly begun. Gondor and Arnor were united once more under a single crown for the first time since the death of Isildur's heirs in the north. Rohan stood beside its ancient ally, bound by the oath first sworn upon the Halifirion, while the free peoples of Middle-earth entered an age of long-awaited peace. The Stewards had accomplished exactly what Mardil had promised nearly 1,000 years before. They had guarded the throne without claiming it, preserved the kingdom through plague, invasion, civil unrest, famine, and war, and surrendered their authority willingly when the rightful king returned. So ended the history of the ruling stewards of Gondor. They were not kings, yet without them there would have been no kingdom left to restore. Their names did not always fill the greatest songs, for much of their labor consisted of rebuilding walls, repairing roads, settling disputes, training soldiers, filling granaries, and enduring years in which nothing glorious happened because they had prevented disaster before it arrived. From Mardil Voronwar to Denethor II, 26 stewards bore the white rod across almost 1,000 years of unbroken service. They preserved the inheritance of Elendil through the darkest centuries of the Third Age, and because they remained faithful to their charge, the crown of Gondor still awaited its rightful heir when the king came again. Their watch ended not in failure, but in fulfillment, and their place in the history of Middle-earth remained forever secure. If you have followed this long history from its first quiet moment to its final page, you may notice that the story was never truly about power. The stewards possessed authority greater than that of almost any other men in Middle-earth, yet the measure of their greatness lay in the fact that they refused to mistake stewardship for ownership. In Tolkien's world, the strongest ruler is often the one who understands that some things cannot be possessed forever. A kingdom is inherited only for a season, wisdom only for a lifetime, and even victory itself must eventually be entrusted to those who come after. The white rod was never a substitute for a crown. It was a reminder that every generation receives a trust rather than a prize. That is why the stewards stand apart from so many rulers who sought glory through conquest or immortality through monuments. Their greatest victories were often invisible. A repaired bridge carried travelers safely for generations without anyone remembering who ordered its stones to be laid. A full granary spared children from hunger after a poor harvest, though no songs were ever written about the careful planning that made it possible. A watchtower rebuilt before it crumbled, a dispute settled before it became bloodshed, a patrol sent one day earlier than expected. Such ordinary acts became the quiet foundations upon which kingdoms endured. Tolkien repeatedly shows that history is preserved not only by heroes who win great battles, but by faithful people who perform necessary duties long before anyone realizes why they mattered. Yet the history of the stewards also carries a warning. Even the wisest and noblest among them remained mortal men, and no strength of will could bear every burden forever. Denethor did not fall because he lacked courage. He fell because he tried to carry alone a weight that no single heart was meant to bear, looking only upon despair until he could no longer recognize hope standing just beyond his sight. Throughout Tolkien's legendarium, evil rarely begins by making good people love darkness. It first persuades them that the light has already failed. Against that lie stands the steady pattern of the entire tale. Help arrives from unexpected roads, faithful alliances endure across centuries, and promises kept by forgotten ancestors become the salvation of later generations. Perhaps that is why Tolkien gives such honor to memory. Mardil kept faith with a king who never returned during his own lifetime. Sirion trusted an oath that would protect Gondor, centuries after both he and Yorl had become names in old chronicles. Faramir surrendered authority at the very moment he could have grasped it, because he understood that true honor lies in restoring what belongs to another. Each steward became only one link in a chain stretching across nearly 1,000 years, and none of those links could have fulfilled its purpose alone. you begin to see that the history of Gondor is not built from isolated lives, but from generations choosing faithfulness over ambition, one after another, until the day their long waiting finally found its answer. And so the story comes back to where it began. The Hall of the Kings still stands beneath the White Tower, its pillars unchanged by triumph or sorrow. The throne that once stood empty is empty no longer. Yet the memory of those who guarded it has not faded with the passing years. If you were to walk there in the quiet of evening, you might imagine the soft footsteps of generations of stewards who entered that hall carrying only the white rod, bowed before a king who was absent, and departed without ever claiming what was not theirs. Outside, the wind would stir the leaves of the white tree, no longer barren but living once more, while the lamps of Minas Tirith glowed warmly against the gathering dusk. In that gentle light, where the story first opened and where it now finds its peace, the long watch has ended, and the City of Kings rests at last beneath the care of the king who returned.